Most people think respect comes from what you say. But what if I told you, people decide whether you matter before you even speak? And the worst part? You might be losing respect in ways you don't even realize. Some people don't speak much, but the moment they enter a room, something shifts. Not loudly, not dramatically, but you feel it. Conversations slow down. People glance at them, just for a second longer. And when they finally speak, no one interrupts. And if you've ever experienced the opposite, you know exactly how strange that feels. Because I didn't always notice people like that. I used to be too busy trying to be heard, trying to say the right thing, trying to add something valuable, trying to not sound awkward. But somehow, none of it worked. I remember sitting in conversations where I had thoughts, good ones, I think, but they would just disappear. Someone else would jump in, or the topic would shift, or worse, no one would react at all. And that silence, it didn't feel calm. It felt like I wasn't even there, like I was background noise in my own life. And I kept asking myself the same question: what am I doing wrong? Because I wasn't rude, I wasn't loud, I wasn't trying to dominate anything. If anything, I was trying too hard to fit in. And maybe that was the problem, because one day, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I was in a group setting, nothing special, just people talking, overlapping, interrupting, trying to be part of the moment. And then there was this one person, quiet. Not awkward quiet, not shy quiet, just still. They weren't rushing to speak. They weren't trying to insert themselves into the conversation. They were just there. And somehow, that made everyone else adjust. People gave them space without realizing it. No one talked over them. No one dismissed them. And when they finally said something, it wasn't louder than anyone else. It wasn't more intelligent. But it landed differently. It stayed. And I remember sitting there thinking, how? How does someone say less and still matter more? Because that broke everything I thought I understood. I always believed respect came from expression, from speaking clearly, from being confident, from showing people what you know. But this felt like something else, something quieter, something deeper. So I started paying attention, not just to what people said, but to what happened before they said anything at all. The way they entered a room, the way they stood, the way they reacted, or didn't react. And the more I observed, the more uncomfortable the truth became. Because it wasn't about communication, it was about presence. And presence is something most of us never really learn. We learn how to talk, how to explain, how to respond. But no one teaches you how to exist in a way that makes people stop and notice. And that realization stayed with me, because it made me question something deeper. Maybe the reason I felt invisible wasn't because people ignored me. Maybe it was because I never gave them a reason to see me differently. Hey, this is Peace Psychology, and I want to explore something with you. Not from a place of, I figured it all out, but from someone who had to question everything they thought they understood about human behavior. Because what I started discovering after that moment changed how I see every conversation, every interaction, every room I walk into. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So if you've ever felt overlooked, or like your presence doesn't quite land the way you want it to, stay with me. Because what we're about to uncover is not about speaking more. It's about understanding what people feel before you even say a word. And if you want more of these kinds of insights, the ones that quietly shift how you see yourself and others, consider subscribing. Not because you have to, but because this is just the beginning of something much deeper. And once I started seeing that, I couldn't stop noticing the small things most people overlook. It wasn't obvious at first. Nothing about it looked dramatic or impressive. In fact, if you weren't paying attention, you'd probably miss it completely. But the more I watched, the more I realized there were patterns. Not in what these people said, but in how they existed in every moment before they spoke. The first thing that stood out to me wasn't confidence in the usual sense. It was something quieter, the way they carried their body. Not exaggerated posture, not forced dominance, just grounded. Their shoulders didn't collapse inward like they were trying to take up less space. Their head wasn't tilted down like they were avoiding being seen. They weren't performing confidence. They were simply not shrinking. And that difference felt subtle at first, But once I noticed it, it became impossible to ignore. Because most of us, without realizing it, make ourselves smaller in social spaces. We adjust, we soften, we try not to stand out too much, and somehow that translates into something people can feel, even if they don't consciously recognize it. But these people didn't do that. They didn't expand aggressively, they just didn't contract, and that alone created a different kind of presence. Then I started noticing their pace. Not just how they walked, but how they moved through moments. They didn't rush into conversations. They didn't rush to respond when someone spoke to them. There was always this small gap, this pause, before they reacted. And at first, I thought maybe they were just slower thinkers, but that didn't feel right because when they did respond, it was clear, direct, intentional. Like they had chosen their words, not just reacted with them. And that pause, that small delay, did something unexpected. It made people wait. It made people lean in, even slightly. Because in a space where everyone is rushing to speak, the person who doesn't rush becomes different. Not louder, but more noticeable. Then there was eye contact. And I'll be honest, this was the part that made me uncomfortable to observe, because I realized how often I avoided it, not intentionally, just habitually. Quick glances, looking away too soon, like I was trying not to be too visible. But these people didn't do that. They looked at you, just long enough to feel present. Not staring, not intense, but steady. And there's something about that steadiness that changes the entire interaction. Because when someone looks at you without hesitation, it creates a moment of clarity, like they're fully there with you. And that kind of attention is rare. Most of us are half in the conversation, half in our own thoughts, but they weren't, and people could feel that. Then I noticed how they listened. Not the surface-level listening we all think we do, but real listening. The kind where they weren't preparing their response while you were talking. The kind where they didn't interrupt to redirect the conversation back to themselves. They let people finish, fully. And more importantly, they responded to what was actually said, not what they assumed. And something interesting happened when they did that. People started opening up more. They spoke longer. They shared more. They seemed more engaged. And I realized something in that moment. When someone feels heard, they naturally assign value to the person who made them feel that way. Not because of what was said, but because of how they were treated. And then there was silence. This one took me the longest to understand. Because silence, for most of us, feels uncomfortable. Like something needs to fill it. Like if we don't say something, the moment will fall apart. But these people didn't seem bothered by it at all. They let silence exist. After a question, after a comment, even in moments of tension, they didn't rush to fix it, and that created something I didn't expect. It gave their presence weight. Because when someone isn't afraid of silence, their words stop being automatic. They become deliberate. And when words feel deliberate, people listen differently. Not because they have to, but because it feels like what's about to be said matters. And somewhere in the middle of all these small observations, something started shifting in how I understood respect. It wasn't about saying more. It wasn't about being more impressive. It was about removing the behaviors that quietly make you easy to overlook. And once I saw that, I realized these weren't random traits. They were signals, and people were reading them long before any words were spoken. And once I realized these weren't just habits, but signals, I started asking a different question. What exactly are people seeing when they look at someone like that? Because clearly, something was being communicated, not through words, but through perception. And the more I thought about it, the more I understood something that felt almost uncomfortable to admit. People don't wait to hear you before they decide how much you matter. They decide it instantly. Before you speak, before you explain, before you even realize it's happening. Your brain does this too. You walk into a room, and without thinking, you already feel who seems confident, who seems uncertain, who seems grounded, and who doesn't. And you don't base that on what they say. You base it on how they are. That's when it clicked for me. Respect isn't logical, it's instinctive. And instinct doesn't listen to your words. It reads your signals, the way you hold your body, the way you respond to pressure, the way you handle attention, or the lack of it. All of it sends information, and the strongest signal of all is control. Not control over other people, control over yourself. Think about it. When someone reacts quickly, gets defensive, rushes to explain, you don't necessarily think less of them, but something feels unstable, like they're being pulled by the moment instead of standing inside it. But when someone pauses, even just for a second, when they don't react the way you expect, something shifts. You start paying attention. Because now they're not predictable, and unpredictability in this sense doesn't feel chaotic. It feels intentional, and intention carries weight. This is something I had completely missed before. I thought respect came from having strong opinions, from speaking clearly, from proving your point. But now I was starting to see it comes from not needing to prove anything at all. And that's a very different kind of power, because when you feel the need to explain yourself constantly, you're not just communicating information, you're signaling uncertainty. You're asking, in a subtle way, to be validated. And people can feel that, even if they don't consciously recognize it. But when someone doesn't rush to explain, doesn't rush to defend, doesn't rush to fill every silence, it creates a different impression. It feels like they're not trying to control how they're perceived. And that alone makes them feel more solid, more certain, more grounded. There's also something else happening underneath all of this. Scarcity, not in the obvious sense, but in attention. When someone reacts to everything, responds instantly, engages with every comment, every moment, every shift, their attention becomes predictable, accessible, and strangely, less valuable. But when someone is selective, when they don't give their reaction away easily, when there's space between what happens and how they respond, that space creates tension, and tension creates focus. You start wondering what they're thinking. You start paying closer attention to what they say, because now their response isn't guaranteed, and that uncertainty draws people in, not because they're trying to be mysterious, but because they're not automatic. And I think that's where everything changes, because most of us are automatic. We react without thinking. We speak without pausing. We fill silence without questioning it. And in doing that, we remove any weight from our presence. Everything becomes immediate. And when everything is immediate, nothing feels intentional. But when you slow that process down, even slightly, you introduce something rare: choice. And choice is visible. People can feel when you're choosing your response instead of just reacting. They can feel when you're grounded instead of being pulled by the moment. And over time, that feeling becomes associated with who you are, not what you say, but how you exist. And that's when the deeper realization hit me. It wasn't that these people were trying to be respected. They weren't thinking about it at all. They were just not doing the things that quietly remove respect, not reacting impulsively, not seeking constant validation, not trying to control every interaction. And because of that, they felt different. And people responded to that difference without even knowing why. So maybe the real shift isn't about adding something new. Maybe it's about noticing what you're already doing. That weakens your presence, and slowly, choosing something else. And once I understood that, I couldn't go back to being the same version of myself in conversations. Because now, every moment felt like a choice. Not a big, dramatic choice, but small ones. The kind you usually don't even notice. How fast you respond, how quickly you fill silence, how often you adjust yourself just to keep things smooth. And for the first time, I started experimenting, not to impress anyone, but to see what would happen if I simply changed my pace. The first thing I did was almost invisible. I stopped reacting immediately. If someone said something, I didn't jump in right away. I let a second pass, just one. And that 1 second felt uncomfortable at first, like I was breaking some unspoken rule. But something interesting happened. People didn't rush to fill that space. They waited. And in that waiting, there was a tension. Then I started noticing my posture, not forcing it, just becoming aware of how often I would slightly collapse into myself, especially in group settings. So I made a small adjustment and I stayed open, not bigger, just present. And it didn't change how I looked, but it changed how I felt. And somehow, that translated outward. Then came eye contact. And this one was harder than I expected, because it's not just about looking at someone, it's about allowing yourself to be seen, which is something most of us avoid without realizing it. So I practiced staying in that moment just a little longer than usual, not forcing intensity, just not escaping it. And something subtle shifted. Conversations started feeling more real, less like performances, more like connection. But the biggest change didn't come from any single behavior. It came from what happened internally. I stopped trying to manage how I was being perceived, that constant background noise of, am I saying the right thing? Do they agree with me? Should I explain this better? It started to fade, not completely, but enough to create space. And in that space, I felt something I hadn't felt before, stability, like I wasn't being pulled in every direction by other people's reactions. And that changed everything. Because once you stop chasing approval in every moment, you stop giving your power away. And people can feel that. Not consciously, but instinctively. And slowly. Very quietly. Things started shifting. People interrupted me less. They didn't rush to override what I was saying. There was more space around my words. Like they carried a little more weight than before. And the strange part, I wasn't saying anything new. I wasn't more intelligent, I wasn't more prepared. I was just different in how I showed up. And that's when I realized something that stayed with me. You don't become respected by adding something impressive. You become respected by removing what weakens your presence. The need to react instantly, the need to be understood immediately, the need to smooth every uncomfortable moment. When those disappear, what's left is something much stronger, a kind of quiet certainty. And that certainty doesn't demand attention. It doesn't chase validation. It just exists. And because it exists, people respond to it. So maybe the real transformation isn't about becoming someone new. Maybe it's about noticing how often you've been moving against yourself and gently choosing something different. The next time you're in a conversation, notice the urge to respond immediately. And don't. Just pause. Let the moment breathe for a second longer than usual. Notice how your body feels. Notice how the other person reacts. Because in that small space, something begins to change. Not just in how they see you, but in how you experience yourself. And that's where it starts. Not with a loud shift, not with a dramatic change, but with a quiet decision. To stop rushing, to stop proving, to stop chasing, and to simply be present. Because the people we admire, the ones who seem naturally respected, they're not doing something extraordinary. They're just not doing the things that make them easy to overlook. And once you understand that, you stop asking, how do I get people to respect me? And start asking something much more honest. What am I doing that takes that away? And if that question stays with you, if it follows you into your next conversation, your next interaction, then something has already started to shift. And if you want to keep exploring these patterns, the quiet ones that shape how people feel you before they understand you, you can stay. Because the more you notice, the more intentional you become. And the more intentional you become, the harder you are to ignore. If you step back and really look at everything we've explored, it all comes down to something surprisingly simple. People don't respond to what you say. They respond to what they feel when they're around you. And that feeling is shaped long before any words come out. It's shaped by your pace, your stillness, your ability to hold a moment without rushing to control it. Most people spend their lives trying to be heard, trying to be understood, trying to prove their value in every interaction. But what if the real shift isn't about adding more? What if it's about removing the habits that quietly make you easy to overlook? The constant reacting, the need to fill silence, the urge to explain yourself before anyone even questions you. Because when you remove those, something else starts to emerge. A kind of quiet clarity, a presence that doesn't chase attention, but naturally draws it. And the deeper lesson here is this. Respect is not something you force from the outside. It's something you reflect from the inside. The way you treat your own time, your own space, your own voice, teaches other people how to treat you. So how do you apply this in your life right now? Start small. In your next conversation, don't rush to respond. Pause. Hold eye contact just a little longer than usual. Let silence exist without trying to fix it. And most importantly, notice how often you're reacting instead of choosing. Because every moment you choose your response instead of giving it away automatically, you're building something most people never develop: presence. And if this made you see yourself a little differently, if you felt that shift from trying harder to becoming more aware, then you're already on the right path. If you want to go deeper into understanding human behavior, emotions, and the hidden patterns behind how people think and act, join the P Psychology community. And if you want more content like this, the kind that doesn't just inform you, but quietly changes how you see yourself, subscribe to the channel. Because this is just the beginning.